Before I start this presentation, I just want to plug Professor Tracy Rowland's new book, Unconformed to the Age, Essays in Catholic Ecclesiology. This is like kind of a unified field theory about what's going on in the church at the moment, and it dovetails really nicely with the data that I'll be presenting this evening and also with the predicted outcomes. And I've read it, it's a cracker, so I can highly recommend it. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in this presentation, but I'm going to keep it moving. As you can see here, we are going to cover quite a lot of ground. Hopefully some of it will be of interest to you. There are 4 key points that I really want to hammer home this evening, and these are the 4 key points. Number 1, we can actually count and measure things about Catholics, which are really useful to know. Number 2, of all of the things we can count and measure, the mass attendance rate has turned out to be really, really important. Number 3, mass goers in Australia today, particularly the ones aged under 40, are really showing us the way to the future church and what it's going to look like in Australia. And number 4 is that we can change some things about that future, but we're going to struggle to change others because we're actually on a demographic trajectory now that usually ends badly, to do with the low birth rate and other things. So those are the 4 points that I'm probably, they're like you take home for this presentation, the things that I'd really like you to bear in mind. So to get started, before we can do any of that, I want you to meet a couple of people. The first one is Bob Dixon. He was formerly at the National Centre for Pastoral Research, which is run by the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. And as far as I'm concerned, this man should be a legend in his own lifetime. I suspect he probably isn't, which I think is a real shame. He was the man who first started our falling rate of mass attendance in Australia. And he's been trying to draw church leadership's attention to this for a long time, over 30 years. He's retired now, but he's still researching and publishing. And in 2007, Bob Dixon led a study into why people stopped coming to Mass in Australia. And this is what he found. Basically, when Catholics stop coming to Mass, they turn into a different type of Catholic from the ones who go to Mass regularly. Now, you might be thinking, well, yes, we all know that. We've all met people who followed that path out of the church. We've seen that change take place. But anecdotal evidence isn't helpful when we're trying to plan the future of the church. So what is helpful is doing a really good data-based study like Bob Dixon did, because you can actually measure those changes and differences in belief. And if you can measure it, then you have the capacity to predict where it's going. Then in 2013, Bob Dixon did another study that identified this emerging group of younger, more conservative Mass goers in Australia, more conservative than their elders. And Tracy McEwen found the same thing in a 2018 study that she did. So the data suggests the existence of a group of younger and more conservative Mass-going Catholics in Australia out there somewhere. We also have something called the National Count of Attendance, thanks largely to Bob Dixon and his crew. We do this every 5 years, and we estimate the number of people attending Mass regularly every Sunday in Australia, usually over about 4 weeks, usually May. The last count was May 2021, of which more later. I'd also like you to meet Professor Stephen Bullivant, who has made a career out of counting Catholics. This is what Stephen does. He observes, he researches, he writes about Catholic worshipping behaviour in particular. He's been doing this for many years now. This is a photo of Stephen holding his book, Mass Exodus, which was on Catholic disaffiliation in Britain and the United States since Vatican II, which is a very interesting study. And this is how I sort of intellectually first met Stephen Bullivant. So in 2019, Stephen and Ben Clements did the Catholics in Britain survey, and they got data from about 1,800 Catholics in the UK, and they found something very interesting about them. They divided them up by rate of Mass attendance. So weeklies go to Mass at least every Sunday. Sometimes they go during the week, some of them go every day. Irregulars are people who go to Mass less than weekly, but more than never, and nevers just don't go to Mass at all. And once people were in these groups, you could predict a lot about their beliefs and behaviours as Catholics. Weeklies were a distinctive type of Catholic, and they were measurably and very different from the irregulars and nevers across a lot of indicators of behaviour and belief. And like Bob Dixon and Tracy McEwen, Stephen and Ben discovered a younger and more conservative group of Catholic massgoers in the UK. So back in 2018, I went to a listening session in my parish for the plenary council. Do you remember those? It was the first stage of collecting responses from us. And it was a real eye-opener because I was in a room with about 20 other people, most of them way older than me, and all of us had different beliefs and ideas about what the Catholic Church was, what it taught, what it could change, and what it should change. Now, I had suspected for some time that even the Catholics who go to Mass on Sunday all thought different things about the church, but it was a little bit disconcerting to see it out there in the open like this. So once I'd met Stephen Bullivant professionally, I said, can we replicate the Catholics in Britain survey here? Because I want to know what's going on in these people's heads. And he said yes, and so we did. And we got a sample of about 2,300 Catholics nationwide, and we found that 3/4 of them were weeklies. So once we got over the shock of this incredibly high rate of mass-going Catholics, we decided this was a brilliant opportunity to find out what Australian Catholics who go to Mass really believe about a whole bunch of things. And this is some of what we found. These are probably the two key findings. Guess what? Exactly the same as the Catholics in Britain study. We found that weeklies are measurably different. They're a different type of Catholic from irregulars and nevers. And we found a big group of younger, more conservative, more committed Catholics, almost all of whom were weeklies. And this is in Australia. We also found that Bob Dixon was right back in 2007 when he said that when you stop going to Mass, you basically become a different type of Catholic. Catholic identity, that is identifying as a Catholic, ticking a box on the census or something like that, is actually pretty meaningless when you look at all the other measures of being a Catholic. And I think that's because Catholic identity costs you nothing. That's why 5 million Australians identified as Catholic in the 2021 census. But Catholic belief and practice costs you a lot, which is why only 8% of those 5 million Catholics attend Mass regularly on Sundays in Australia today. Now, at this point, you might be saying, now, Philippa, aren't you being very judgy? How can you say that Catholics who go to Mass are any better than Catholics who don't? But I'm not saying that. I'm saying they're different. Not better or worse, because I can't see their souls, but I can tell you that they're measurably different in their survey responses. It turns out that the Mass attendance rate is probably the most robust measure we have for the general health and life of the Catholic Church in any English-speaking country. And it's also very doable. It's really just a head count. So it's not that hard to do. Hard to get it right, but not that hard to do. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of things that Stephen and I found in the Australian data. So we asked our Catholics, do you believe in certain core doctrines? And I've listed them all here. You can see what they all are. And people could answer yes, maybe or no to that question. So this is the percentage of each group of Mass attenders who said yes. These are all the people who said yes, they believe in these things. As you can see, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. I mean, heaven is a very popular belief there. But when we look at other core beliefs, you'll find, as a general rule, the irregulars and nevers are much less enthusiastic. Fewer of them said yes to this question. So the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. 93% of the weeklies said yes, they believed in that, but only 51% of the irregulars believed in it, and 37% of the nevers believed in it. Even some of the weeklies start to get a bit wobbly when we get down to the existence of hell and purgatory, especially purgatory, which is such a specifically Catholic belief. It's one of the things that sets us apart from so many other Christian denominations. But just 76% of our weeklies said yes, they believed in purgatory, but only 26% of the irregulars and 20% of the nevers. You'll also begin to notice from figures like this that there's not a big difference between irregulars and nevers. They poll in a very similar way, but there's a big difference between them and the weeklies. So irregulars and nevers kind of look similar, and then there's a big gap between them and the weekly data. So this is what Bob Dixon was talking about back in 2007. When you stop attending Mass regularly, you can actually measure a difference in people's beliefs. So with that data on belief in purgatory, I started to get a little bit worried, and I thought to myself, how can it be that only 76% of weekly mass goers believe in the existence of purgatory? But there's no need to panic, because I found the solution when I split my respondents up into the under 40s and the over 40s. So all those previous studies that I've talked about identified a younger group of more conservative believers. And again, in the Catholics in Australia data, when you split the weeklies, this is just the weeklies, and they've been split into the under 40s and the over 40s, you get a different picture again. Here, you can see that our younger weeklies, the under 40s, are much more likely to say yes to these core beliefs, including hell and purgatory. So 92% of weeklies aged under 40 said yes to the existence of purgatory, compared to just 66% of the over 40s. We also asked our Catholics whether they thought the Church should change its teaching on various things, and we started with ordination. That's always popular. So should we ordain more married men than we are currently already ordaining? Should we allow already ordained priests to marry? And should we ordain women? As you can see, and this again, these are the people who said, yes, we should do all of these things. So these people said yes to these questions. And as you can see, the people most likely to agree that the Church should change its teachings on these three topics are the irregulars and nevers by a very substantial margin. 67% of the irregulars and nevers said, yes, we should ordain women, but only 22% of the weeklies agreed that we should. Again, let's split them up by age. Here they are again, weeklies under 40 and over 40. 31% of the older weeklies think that we should ordain women, but only 6% of the younger weeklies agreed with that. So there is no broad base of support out there among younger mass-going Catholics in Australia for radical changes to the Church's teaching on ordination. Quite the opposite, in fact. And this was consistent across all of the questions about changing doctrine and practice that we asked in the Catholics in Australia survey, that younger people absolutely did not support these changes. So why does this matter? There's a bunch of reasons. In fact, it really matters because it's almost like the Da Vinci Code for interpreting many strange things that are happening in the Catholic Church today. For example, surveys and opinion polls of Catholics always return really strange results, unless you divide the respondents up by mass attendance rate, and then it all falls into place. You can't say that a survey of people, most of whom identify as Catholic but never go to Mass, represents the sensus fidei of the Church. The sensus fidei is very carefully defined in the Catechism in sections 91 to 93. This is not it. This is just like asking randoms. And so you're going to get really random answers. It also matters because we talk a big game about listening in the Church right now, but it seems to be like a big open slather, and we're randomly trying to pick the Holy Spirit out of a big mess of input. It would all make a lot more sense and would probably be easier on everyone if we knew who we were listening to. Who are we listening to? So what with all of this, over the last few years, I've been doing a lot of reading and immersing myself in a lot of church data sets. And this is the kind of stuff that I've been doing for the last few years, folks. It's if you've been trying to reach me and I haven't answered my phone, this is why. And this is what I found out. So first thing I found out actually is that we could do a lot better with our church data collection because some of it doesn't add up and some of it's a bit wonky and so forth. What I also discovered is that we have a two-tier church. We have like the parochial diocesan structure that we're all familiar with. And then we have something which I call the business arm. And I don't have a lot of time in this presentation, so I can't talk a lot about the business arm's future, but I'll talk about one section of it, the Catholic school system, which I think is a good example of how we need to start doing some forward planning now based on the data. So reading all of that data, masses of it, this is what the data is saying to me about the likely future of the church in Australia. And for those of you who are listening only, it's a picture of a dumpster fire in a flood. It's bad. What the data is telling me is that we are in a great deal of trouble. But what I'm hearing from church leadership is that everything is awesome. Everything is cool when you're part of a team. I'm going to share with you part of an email I received from someone who is in a senior diocesan position in another diocese, not my diocese, but it is quite a big diocese somewhere else in Australia. And I'll read the salient points of this email for the benefit of those who are simply listening. And I quote, "This putting people into categories is all part of the depersonalisation of modern times and reducing us all to statistics. Contrary to this is the fundamental tenet of our faith that the imago Dei, God's image, is imprinted in each person. As the letter to the Romans reminds us, God's wisdom and knowledge have infinite depth, so it is not for us to know the mind of God. Therefore, I don't believe it is within our scope or capacity to predict the shape, size, or membership of our church as we journey together into the future." End quote. If this attitude is common in diocesan administration, then we are in way more trouble than even I thought possible. Numbers are not the enemy. Numbers are actually our friends, and we can use them to help us. So I actually think it's well within our scope and capacity to do this work. And thankfully, the ACBC agrees with me, which is why we have a National Centre for Pastoral Research. We should have done all this at the Plenary Council, but we didn't. So instead, you're getting me with some very homemade, rather dodgy maps that I'm going to show you because I don't have mapping software, and some very basic data modelling on where we might be going based on that data that I've collected and that I've absorbed from all of those other data sources. I think there are some other reasons also why we are not having this conversation more publicly in the church, and that is that we are sitting ducks right now. Catholics are not a solid voting bloc anymore. We all vote in completely different ways, so we can't frighten a political party into doing what we want. We have tax-free status, we get a lot of government funding, and we also own a lot of property. And we are hated more and more by ordinary Australians. And if you don't believe me, go and find a secular newspaper article online on the Catholic Church in Australia and then read the online comments box. You will quickly find out just what ordinary people in this country think about the Catholic Church and about Catholics. Now, I personally think that the best way to tackle all of this is to face it honestly and deal with it. But instead, we seem to be getting a lot of guff from strategic communications directorates and offices in the church. And I'll give you an example of this. In May 2024, when the last national count of mass attendance was released, it showed that we'd lost around a third of our pre-COVID mass attenders across the entire country. This was a catastrophic wipeout in numbers, never before seen since we started measuring mass attendance in Australia. The ACBC's Comms Office issued the following media release. And the headline says, "National survey shows that Catholics are online and multicultural," end quote. The bad news about the huge loss in numbers was buried in the middle of the article, which no one reads. People read the beginning and end of an article. They never read the middle. Everything is awesome. Everything is cool when you're part of an online and multicultural team. So, with all of that in mind, this map, which I swiped from Wikipedia, shows Australia's Catholic diocese. So just to get you a bit oriented there, you'll see we have big ones in regional areas. We have lots of smaller ones where the population is more dense in Australia, and that's exactly what you'd expect to see. And this is the kind of mapping that the National Centre for Pastoral Research is doing. It's based on the 2021 census. So it tells us where the nominal Catholics in Australia live. These are the people who ticked the Catholic box on the census in 2021. And you can see we have a lot of them living in Bathurst and Parramatta and Wagga. In fact, most of the eastern seaboard of Australia looks like pretty solid Catholic heartlands. What this map doesn't tell us is where the mass-going Catholics are. So why is that potentially more important when we're talking about the future of the church? I think the data on mass-going Catholics is what we really need to be looking at, because these people are the future of the church in Australia, or at the very least the parochial diocesan tier of the church, which is actually like our core business. These are the core group of people you can rely on going forward They are heavily invested. They do everything in our parishes, and they are also mostly raising their children to be future Mass-going Catholics as well. We need to find out as much as possible about them. And the first thing I think we need to know is where they all live, because I think that's a map of the future of the Catholic Church in Australia. So as I say, with my dodgy homemade map, this is where our Mass goers in Australia live. Most of them, this is like, if you can imagine all the Mass goers in Australia as 100%, this is where they're divided up across the country. So 20% or more live in Melbourne, which is amazing. After that, about 10% or more live in Brisbane, Sydney, and Perth. There's like about 10% of all our practicing Mass-going Catholics in Australia live there. After that, Parramatta and Adelaide have about 5% each of all of our Mass-going Catholics. And after that, all of the others are spread out very thinly across all of those remaining dioceses in Australia. So the map looks very different when we look at the people who are actually going to Mass. This next map shows the rate of Mass attendance in each diocese in Australia in 2021. So what we do then, we take all the people who identified as Catholic in the census, and then we look at how many people in that diocese identified, like said they were going to Mass count, or were counted in the Mass count. And so what we have here is, like, Darwin looks amazing, but remember there's not a lot of Catholics in Darwin, which is why their Mass attendance rate looks so high. But in Perth, Port Pirie, Ballarat, Wagga, and Melbourne, round about 8 to maybe high 9% of Catholics who live in that diocese actually go to Mass. Outside of the urban areas, it's really scanty. So this tells us that we are predominantly an urban church in Australia. Remember all those Catholic heartlands that we saw in the National Centre for Pastoral Research map, where all those nominal Catholics lived? They're largely bleached out. Wagga still isn't too bad, but mostly it's all been bleached out. So that's Mass-going Catholics. What about priests? Thankfully, we've got plenty of diocesan priests. I know you've all been told for decades that we don't have enough, but actually we do. The national ratio at present is about one diocesan priest for every 260 Mass-going Catholics. Now, I've put both sets of data on this chart, and I've collapsed the Mass-going Catholics so that I can fit them both on the same chart. So you just add a couple of zeros to the end of the Mass-going Catholics and you'll see how many people we're actually talking about. But this was just to show you how the number of Mass-going Catholics has been plummeting, but the decline in priests has been very gentle and gradual. So basically it tells us we'll probably run out of laity before we run out of diocesan priests. And remember, this doesn't include priests in religious orders in Australia, of which we have quite a good number as well. So let's have a look at the ordinations data. Here it is. This is from 1970 to 2021, and the ordinations have been ticking away. We've never had zero, thank goodness. It's gotten pretty low. I think 2004 was the worst year. I think there were about 13 in 2004, but there's never been zero in a year. So they're just gently on the upswing as well, which is a promising trend. I can also tell you that the number of men leaving the active ministry after ordination in Australia has halved since around the year 2000. So from 1970 to 1999, about 15 priests a year would leave the active ministry. Not the recent ordained ones. You know, this is like priests who perhaps have been a priest for a number of years. It was about 15 a year. Since 2000, it's been barely 7 a year. So this is all good. This next map, again, very homemade, shows the ratio of diocesan priests and Mass-going Catholics in every diocese in Australia. Now, again, don't panic about Darwin. Darwin has almost no diocesan clergy, but they have lots of religious priests. So actually, they're fine. Please don't panic about their Mass attendance ratio there. But you'll see from this map that the worst ratio in Australia is Parramatta. And even the worst ratio is actually not that bad, like 1 to maybe 350 Catholics. That's not that big a group of people. So you can also see how good the ratios are in the rural areas. Now, obviously, that's because the Catholics live a long way away from each other. You can't put one priest in Geraldton and expect him to look after everyone. So you need to have more priests per people in rural areas. Whereas if you live in Parramatta, if your priest is not well this weekend, you just drive to the church down the road and you can go to Mass there. So we can actually get by on fewer priests in urban areas because we're much closer to each other and to all our little churches. So really what these maps should be telling you and what this data should be telling you is that we don't have a priestly numbers problem, but we do have a bit of a priestly distribution problem. We perhaps haven't got them in the right places in Australia. So these are the Mass attendance totals that the National Count of Attendance has been telling us since 2001. And you can see how it has been dropping very steadily. We've lost about 350,000 people in that time period, nearly just over 20 years. So how did we get here? How did we lose so many people? And this is where there's been a lot of hand-wringing about unpopular teachings in the church and the impact of clergy abuse and so forth. But actually, there have been three really important major demographic shifts in the Catholic Church in Australia during this period. We really need to look at them first before we talk about anything else, because they will actually explain why we've lost so many Mass-going Catholics. And it's really simple. It's hatches, matches, and dispatches. So births, marriages, and deaths. But I'm going to look at them in reverse order. I'm going to start with the death rate. So first of all, a huge number of our older Catholic Mass-goers in that period died. If you can visualise the church in Australia in terms of a big mushroom, we have a big canopy of people aged over 60 at the top, and it's supported on this quite thin stem of the under 60s. People over 60 die more frequently than people under 60. So I worked out the Mass-going Catholic death rate, or I got a good approximation of it anyway. We can't get these people back, and we shouldn't try because that's a sin. And they didn't die because the church didn't change its teaching on various things. They died because they were old. So there's that. And that's a really important factor we have to look at. Now let's look at matches, marriages. So in 1966, the church relaxed the restriction on what we used to call mixed marriages. And that's a marriage between a Catholic and a non-Catholic. The church has always been very cautious of this because there's a known relationship between a mixed marriage and the Catholic partner lapsing, disaffiliating, the children disaffiliate, the children marry non-Catholics, and the problem just sort of spreads. But by 1970 in Australia, once that precept changed, the rate of mixed marriages shot up to about 50% of all Catholic marriages in Australia, and it stayed there. It got higher, in fact, and that's over a solid period of about 30 years. There was a very high percentage of mixed marriages in Australia, and this has been a huge contributing factor to the decline in Mass attendance. You practically pre-programmed your Catholics to stop going to Mass by encouraging them to make mixed marriages. The John Paul II generation are reversing this trend. So from about 2000, the rate of Catholics marrying other Catholics began to rise. And nowadays, it's about 60% of all Catholic marriages will be two Catholics marrying each other. And I think we'll probably see that increase over time as well. Births. This is part of a larger conversation we're having in Australia right now about our lack of growth and the low birth rate. There was a dramatic fall in the Catholic birth rate in Australia, but it actually happened in the first half of the 20th century, well before Vatican II and Humanae Vitae. So Humanae Vitae probably came too late to Australia. It's like shutting the gate after the horses bolted. I would guess that the current nominal Catholic birth rate, the people who identify as Catholic but they don't go to Mass, I'd say the birth rate's probably about 1.7 per woman, which is the national rate. That is well below replacement rate. But again, I think younger Mass-going Catholics in Australia are bucking this trend as well. So only after looking at those three very, very important demographic shifts do I think we should look at the other reasons why people have stopped coming to Mass. We've also done 3 national studies of these people, and they all say the same thing. They all tell us why they've stopped coming to Mass. They don't believe it's a sin to miss Mass on Sundays, and they don't agree with the church on some issues and or don't believe what the church teaches. And when you do a study like this, these reasons are always ranked far more highly above all of the other complaints that people have about the church. So the National Centre for Pastoral Research is currently doing a 4th study on this. They'll be looking specifically for things like the impact of clergy sexual abuse and COVID-19 church closures. So that will be very interesting to see when it appears. So what might the future look like for the church in Australia? I think we can tell a fair bit about the future by looking at the present. For starters, I think fewer and fewer people are going to identify as Catholics in the census. So I suspect we might be as low as 10% by the time we get to 2051. So what I'm going to offer you is some of my very best amateur hour armchair forecasting now, and I will explain that as I go. So basically what I did, I came up with a rate of decline in mass attendance for each diocese in Australia over the last 10 years, and I took that figure forward in 10-year intervals. So I'll show you an example using Adelaide. So in 2021, there were an estimated around about 20,000 mass goers in the Archdiocese of Adelaide. But over the previous 10 years, they'd lost 20.7% of all of their mass goers. So every 10 years, I took another 20.7% off the mass going population. And that took it down to just under 10,000 mass goers by 2051. So nationally, when I did this to every diocese, this is what we ended up with. And it's just under 200,000 people, fewer priests, but still about 1 to every 150 mass going Catholics. Yeah, not looking good. I mean, you can see that there's a big difference between the dioceses. The top 5, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth and Parramatta, they still have mass attendance figures in five figures, but it's looking really bad everywhere else. So how likely are we to end up with this? How good are my numbers? Well, look, this is just modelling. This is just based on exactly what I told you, the previous rate of decline. Any number of things could change this. I've given you a list of things here that could possibly change it. Papal elections, episcopal appointments, government persecution, migration numbers, very important, religious worker visa conditions, eschatological events. Any one of these things could make decline faster or it could slow it down. However, with demographic changes like births, marriages and deaths, what happens is that you get to like a point of no return, like a tipping point. And I think we've gone past that in the Catholic Church in terms of our births and deaths. And I think that damage may be right now irreversible. Well, not irreversible, but it will take a very, very long time to make up for that damage that's been done. So what are we likely to see? Parish closures, folks, diocesan changes, in persona episcopacy solutions, which do eventually lead to merged dioceses. And I'm going to show you an example of how this has been done very recently in Wales. So this is Mark O'Toole. He's beaming cheerfully here. Since 2022, he's been Archbishop of Cardiff and Bishop of Menevia, which were 2 dioceses next door to each other. So Cardiff had lots of Catholics and quite a few diocesan priests. Menevia had almost no mass-going Catholics, but quite a few diocesan priests. So what the Pope has done as of September 2024 is he's united those 2 dioceses to create the new Archdiocese of Cardiff-Menevia, headed by Archbishop O'Toole. That's given him 80 priests to use across his diocese now. So how and where might we do something similar in Australia? So what I've done, this is Fantasy Island now. This is me basically erasing diocesan boundaries simply because I can. So I have no supernatural foreknowledge of events. I have no inside gossip from the ACBC. This is just based on the numbers of mass goers that I think we'll end up with in these dioceses and where it might make sense to merge some of them, even if it just merging them so that we can spread the clergy over a bigger area. So this is what I think it might look like. So Perth and Bunbury may end up united either in persona episcopacy, either with one bishop managing both, or they merge the 2 dioceses. Darwin, I have no idea, so I've just left it completely alone. Queensland, potentially 2 dioceses. Melbourne would absorb Hobart, and I think all of the other dioceses in Victoria could become like the Diocese of Victoria. New South Wales is interesting. The sort of hinterland diocese I've merged into something called the Diocese of MacKillop, that's what I've called it, and the Diocese of Paulding in the north. I think Sydney will remain the Archdiocese because it's got a very big population, but potentially it could absorb Parramatta or Broken Bay or Wollongong. So that's what I think it could potentially look like. And of course, that's very different from what it is now. But I think it takes into account the hard realities of what's happening to the church here. So with that in mind, what factors might actually help us? Where are our assets and our strengths? One of my key points of this talk is that Mass-going Catholics are the future of the church here. So where can we find more Mass-goers? That's what we really need. We'll start having a look at the Eastern rites, where we know they have far higher Mass attendance rates than in the Western Church, but unfortunately they also have very tiny populations. And I think I've been very happy to include these numbers here because a lot of people talk about these churches, but they really have no idea of just how small nationally these congregations are. But if they could maintain their numbers for the next 25 years, they will be a serious contributor to the church in Australia by 2051. And the community to watch there, where I've done the highlighter, are the Surrey Malabars, because they've put on some serious numbers since they first came here. They come from a very populous part of the world. Lots of them could come to Australia, and they also have this apparently unlimited supply of celibate clergy. So they have a very strong vocations culture in that community, and potentially this is fantastic for our church here. So what about the traditional Latin Mass? Very high rate of Sunday Mass attendance. We measured this in the Catholics in Australia survey, and it was around 95%, also younger than most other Mass goers in Australia. So the National Count of Attendance has been counting Latin Mass goers since 2006, so we can see that they have actually increased their numbers, perhaps not as much as people think, and this is why I wish Latin Mass communities would do regular head counts, because then we'd actually have something that, we could sort of hang our hat on in terms of the size of this population. So taking these numbers forward that I've got from the National Count of Attendance, if they increased their numbers by 50% every 5 years, they'd account for about 20% of all Mass goers in Australia by 2051. So what about migrants? So this is an interesting one. I looked at the net migration figures for 2022 to 2023. So you can see what country people come from, what the Catholic population is in that country, if you do a bit of Googling. And then if you do even more Googling, you might find out the rate of Mass attendance. Now, these numbers vary wildly, and they may be way off and really inaccurate, but you can use them to estimate how many Mass-going migrants we might be absorbing. And I made it to be about 35,000 in that 1 year of 2022 to 23. So if I'm in the right ballpark, and if we keep that up every year, and they all stay here and don't go home, and they all keep going to Mass, and they don't die before 2051, we'll have nearly 1 million extra Mass-going Catholics by 2051. That Catholics born overseas would make up most of the entire Mass-going population in Australia. So the church in Australia would be a very, very different place at parish and diocesan level in 2051 if this one panned out. So that's the parochial diocesan part of the church. But what about the future of the business arm, the schools and healthcare? I'd like to show you what's going on in our Catholic schools right now, according to the data which I have. So this is what's happening in primary schools. So on the left-hand side, that's the proportion of Catholic and non-Catholic enrolment in 2011. And on the right-hand side, that's the proportions in 2021. So you can see that non-Catholics, their enrolment has really increased. Now remember, these are just people who ticked the Catholic box in the census. We don't know how many of them are going to Mass. So that's what's happening in primary schools. And this is what's happening in secondary schools. You'll see it's actually the same trend happening. And this is what it looks like by diocese. So we've got some dioceses with very healthy percentages of nominal Catholics enrolled in Catholic primary and secondary schools. But we've got some down the bottom where it's fallen below 50% in the secondary schools. So I worked out the rate of change that's happened in each diocese, and I took that forward as well. So this is what we might be looking at in 2026, and this is just 2 years away. Now there's 18 dioceses with less than 50% Catholic enrolment in their Catholic secondary schools. You'll also see that the primary school Catholic enrolment is dropping as well, starting to drop below 50%. This is 2031. I've highlighted the diocese where they're still managing more than 50% Catholic enrolments. And this is potentially 2051, where basically only Sydney is still holding the fort. Many of these dioceses will have no Catholic students enrolled in their Catholic schools. So there's a few things I'd like to point out here. The first is that we've got no data on any evangelisation effect on parents and children in our Catholic schools. We talk a lot about how having non-Catholics in the Catholic schools exposes them to the church and the faith, but we have zero evidence of anything happening as a result of that. No one's measuring it. You do hear the odd anecdote, but there's no solid data. I think it's a terrible shame that the religious literacy test results for our Catholic primary school children aren't routinely made public like NAPLAN. The Catholics in Australia study that Stephen and I did found a very interesting relationship in the data. We found that the less Catholic schooling a person had, the more conforming, believing and mass going the Catholic was. And that was across the board, all age groups and all over Australia. So the less Catholic schooling you had, the better your indicators of Catholic belief and practice. So when it gets to that critical tipping point where there are hardly any Catholics in the Catholic school system, what could we do with it? We could lease it, we could sell it, or we could decide to completely redefine what we mean by Catholic education and simply call them schools in the Catholic tradition, schools with Catholic building names, and we could cut ties with them at diocesan level. This means looking at Catholic education, as just a business now and no longer a part of the Church's mission. So please take a deep breath. I'm coming into land now and wrapping up. Back in 2021, I first wrote about some of this stuff, and I included some advice in that article for all the future young Catholics who are going to have to tackle this stuff. And it's advice gleaned from experience and also from the wonderful young Catholic people around me who have taught me how they're surviving and thriving in a shrinking church. So what can we do? Here we go. Do you want to change the future church in Australia for the better? You start by letting God change you for the better. That's where it starts. It starts with me and then my family, then my parish and then my diocese. I can heartily recommend praying at least part of the Divine Office daily. It's like plugging into mains electricity. And when you feel isolated and alone in the church, it's a really great relief. Priests, we need them and we need to look after them. Many of them are sad, they're tired, they're demoralised because we are not responding, to their ministry. We're not on fire. No matter what they do, they can't seem to wake us up. So try to help them and not to hinder them in their work, and we'll probably all do a lot better. Do something positive. Stop cursing the darkness. Try lighting a few candles. Do what you can do locally. As the church gets smaller, we all need to pitch in a lot more and help with the heavy lifting. Evangelise when and where you can. This is your baptismal mission anyway, so perhaps now is the time for you to start living it. The best and most effective form of evangelisation. The best and most effective form of evangelisation is not the gotcha question. It's showing people how you are living your faith and your life. Embrace your Catholic weird. We should be measurably different from other people. We should stand out by our love of each other and our care for the most vulnerable in our community and our willingness to help others. That's what distinguished the early Christians from the truly horrible world around them. That's what won so many converts. Martyr's Law, which I invented, states that the smaller a local church gets, the weirder it gets. This means that one of the greatest challenges we face as a local church is to get on with each other. It's too easy to form cliques and factions and get snooty and oversensitive with each other, and all of this weakens the local church. You don't have to like everyone, and some people simply aren't safe to be around, but you do need to be patient with everyone. Cults, a very real danger in a smaller local church. And here are some signs of a cult if you think you might be in one. A culture of unquestioning obedience, lots of secrecy, rules that are a bit arbitrary and tend to benefit the leadership rather than the members. And outside the cult, there is no salvation, or your salvation can get a little bit precarious. I won't labour the point on this because I'm sure we can all think of unhappy examples where people have been really hurt. Cults are inimical to the church. We are not a mystery religion. We don't have secret teachings or rituals. Anyone can become a Catholic. We can do all of this in public. The other thing is, don't be the English Catholics in the 19th century. And what I mean by that is these people invested heavily in resisting the Anglican dominant culture to the point where they got very inward looking. So when the second spring came along in the mid-19th century and the church suddenly blossomed in England, they weren't ready for it. A lot of them had gotten used to being a small, persecuted, resistant church, and they quite liked that. They were quite comfortable with this, and they resented the influx of new Catholics, the converts, the poor Irish working class migrants. Don't be these people. Keep doing what you're doing. I can see people connecting with each other, forming intentional communities, lots of gathering, lots of supporting happening. And it's being driven by this core of younger, mass-going Catholics who I think represent the real future of the church in Australia. I can see it in the data, and I can also see it happening in people's lives. It's very exciting. Speaking of data, we could really lift our game with data collection in our diocese, and I think it also needs to be made public and shared a lot more. This is what we're now doing in the research sciences. We have open data sets, and the church really needs to catch up with this. We need to think much harder about what we're spending our money and time on, and if it's worth it. What works? What doesn't? We only find out if we follow up. So how effective is RCIA over time? How effective is youth ministry? What is its purpose? All good questions that we need to answer. So I have written a book about this, and it's gone to the publisher, and I hope that when it eventually appears, you will all buy copies of it. I've asked some of you to help me with it, so thank you for those who've given me their 2 cents worth on the future of the church. I'm very grateful to you. And that basically is me done. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've gotten something out of it all. Please, if you want a copy of the slides, I can help you with it. I'm just going to walk you through the additional material. That's my email address. If you want to give me a hoy about anything, just make sure you spell my first name correctly. This is Bob Dixon's work if you want to look it up for yourself. This is the National Centre for Pastoral Research Projects and Papers. Again, if you want to look these up for yourself, and I recommend that you do get your head around this stuff yourself. It's all out there for you to use. These are the reports from Stevens and my project on the Catholics in Australia. That's the first 5. That's the rest of them. There is an additional one on Catholic schooling, report number 11, which has subsequently appeared as well. If you want to read any of my articles in the Catholic Weekly on the demographic crisis in the church, this is a selection of them. And there's also a selection here of articles about the Catholics in Australia survey that I wrote for the Catholic Weekly. And finally, here's the papers from my COVID-19 study on Australian Catholics and how they cope with church closures, if you want to see how COVID-19 potentially has impacted on our mass attendance rates. So that's me done. Thank you very much for joining me for this presentation, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll be very happy to answer them.